She was 28 years old and had nothing left but a machinist's hammer with a hickory handle worn smooth by her father's grip, a canvas bundle of clothing, and $11.40 sewn into the hem of her skirt. 2 days later, in the yard behind a failed land office in San Marcial, New Mexico Territory, she spent $2 on a stained survey map that no cattleman trusted, no miner wanted, and no sensible person believed was worth the paper beneath its mildew. It showed no claim of value. It marked no spring known to the army, no vein of silver, no grazing basin, no road fit for freight. Across one corner, in ink gone brown with age, someone had drawn the crooked line of an abandoned railroad grade that ended in open desert. But what nobody knew, what she could not have imagined, was that beneath the sand at the end of that useless line lay a locomotive buried whole, and inside its sealed iron tender rested a 30-year-old secret that would unmake the man who cast her out and build her a new life from the wreckage. So settle near the fire, if you have one, and let the room grow still. Tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe if stories of patient hands and quiet strength belong in your keeping. Let us tell you the story of Clara Vale. Clara had been born in 1844, in a narrow house behind a wheelwright's shed outside Hannibal, Missouri, where the Mississippi carried saw logs, ferry bells, hogsheads, and human rumor southward beneath a sky the color of hammered lead. Her earliest memories were not of dolls or hymn books, but of iron rims cooling in trough water, oak spokes stacked beneath canvas, and the dry rasp of her father's file working a burr from the edge of a steel tire. Elias Vale had been a wheelwright first, a blacksmith second, and a mechanic whenever necessity presented him with a machine no one else understood. He shod mules for freight men, repaired threshing gears, trued wagon axles, brazed cracked kettles, rebuilt hand pumps, sharpened quarry drills, and once kept a river winch alive for 3 seasons with nothing but scrap brass, lampblack, and an old clock spring. His shop smelled of coal smoke, wet ash, linseed oil, horse sweat, pine shavings, and hot scale. Clara loved it without knowing the word for love. She swept beneath the workbench before she was tall enough to see over it. She sorted square nuts from hexagonal ones, though Elias told her the newer shape was still an affectation and would never seem honest to him. She learned the names of tools by weight before she learned them by letters. The tongs with the long reins were for wagon tire. The narrow peen hammer was for drawing a rivet. The flatter rested square against heated iron and told the metal where obedience ended and fracture began. Elias never spoke to her as though she were a child when they stood inside the shop. He spoke to her as an apprentice. When she was 7, he showed her how grain lived inside wood, though it appeared still to those who had never split it. He set a length of ash across the bench and ran his thumb along the pale lines. "Everything has a grain," he said. "Timber does. Iron does once it has been worked enough. People do too." He placed a froe against the end and struck it lightly. The wood opened along itself. "You work with it, not against it. Force has its use, but understanding lasts longer." She remembered that sentence because he repeated it in different forms over the years, whenever her impatience outran her hands. When she tried to straighten a bent rod while it was too cold, he stopped her. "Mind the grain." When she drove a wedge into elm at the wrong angle and buried it to the eye, he said nothing until she had worked it loose. "Mind the grain." When a teamster cursed her for refusing to fit a cracked wheel back on his wagon, Elias waited until the man had gone, then set the broken hub on the floor between them. "You heard his anger," he said. "But the grain of him was fear. His freight was late. His employer was cruel. That does not make him right, but it tells you where to place your hand." Clara learned to listen to more than words. By 12, she could judge heat by color, red for bending, orange for drawing, yellow for welding, white only when ruins stood close. By 14, she could upset the end of an axle, punch a clean hole through strap iron, and fit a replacement spoke so closely that the line between old wood and new disappeared beneath the tire. Her father did not praise often. He nodded. The nod meant more. On her 16th birthday, Elias gave her the machinist's hammer. It was not new. The head bore 3 shallow scars near the cheek, and the hickory handle had been worn smooth and dark where his hand had held it through 20 years of work. He had polished the face until it shone like a small moon. "A good hammer is not for striking hard," he told her. "It is for striking true." She weighed it in her palm. The balance felt like certainty. She asked why he was giving away his best one. He smiled then, though grief had already begun to gather behind his ribs. "Because it knows the family." That winter, Elias developed a cough that no poultice softened. It began as a dry clearing of the throat in the mornings and grew into a deep tearing sound that bent him over the quench barrel with one hand pressed beneath his breastbone. The doctor called it consumption and prescribed rest, broth, laudanum, and a warmer climate, as though warmth could be purchased with advice. Elias worked until he could no longer lift the sledge. Then Clara worked while he sat near the forge and instructed her. He died before spring. There was no final speech. He had spent his words carefully while living and did not discover wastefulness at the end. On the last evening, he asked Clara to bring him the hammer. She laid it across his palm, though his fingers could no longer close around the handle. "Work true," he whispered. By morning, his hand had grown cold beneath hers. Clara buried him on a hill above the river, beneath a cottonwood whose roots had already lifted one corner of the Vale family stone. She returned to the shop alone, opened the shutters, laid coal in the forge, and worked. For 11 years, she kept the business alive. She repaired what broke. She took no advantage of hunger, weather, ignorance, or urgency. When a widow came with a stove lid split across the center, and only 6 cents to offer, Clara braised it for 4. When a farmer's wagon collapsed during harvest, she stayed at the bench through the night, and charged him the daylight rate. She sharpened plowshares evenly, balanced wheels honestly, and wrote every account in a small blue book with her father's square figures. Her reputation traveled farther than she did. Men who objected to placing iron in a woman's hands stopped objecting when their machinery failed. Skill was harder to insult in person. The shop might have endured another generation if it had stood only upon timber, brick, coal, and labor. But the land beneath it had passed through a mortgage, the mortgage through a bank, and the bank into the hands of Silas Bell. Silas Bell owned no forge, no field, no mill, and no team of horses. Yet by 1872, he possessed a portion of nearly everything that did. He had begun as a clerk in a shipping office with narrow shoulders, clean cuffs, and a gift for remembering debts longer than favors. Later he became a lender. Then a partner. Then the president of Bell Mercantile and Trust, whose sign hung above 3 polished windows on Main Street, gold lettering upon black glass. He was a man of paper and ink. He measured farms in acreage, shops in collateral, men in signatures, and grief in days past due. Clara met him only twice before he took her home. The first time, he entered the shop while she was shrinking an iron tire over a new hickory wheel. He stood beyond the sparks, wearing a dark coat too fine for the dust, and watched her direct 2 laborers with the calm economy of someone who knew exactly how long the metal would remain willing. When the tire settled, Clara poured water over the rim. Steam rose around them. Bell did not compliment the work. He asked to see the mortgage papers. Clara wiped her hands and brought him the documents Elias had signed 12 years earlier, when illness had forced him to borrow against the property. Clara had paid each installment recorded in her blue book. Some had been delivered in coin, others by repair work performed for businesses under contract to Bell. Silas turned the papers slowly. "These credits were never entered at the bank," he said. "They were entered with your agents. My agents did not possess authority to amend the principal. They accepted the work. They accepted repairs. In place of payment. That is your understanding. It was theirs as well." Silas closed the folder. "Understanding is not an instrument." He spoke without contempt. Contempt would have required heat. Clara showed him receipts bearing the names of his warehouse foreman, his livery superintendent, and the manager of a flour mill in which Bell held controlling interest. Silas examined each one, then arranged them by date. "These acknowledge service," he said. "They do not state that the service discharged debt. The men who signed them said it did. Then you may seek remedy from those men. One was dead. One had gone west. One had been dismissed and could not be found. Silas knew this. He had known it before entering the shop. The second meeting took place in his office 3 weeks later. On his desk lay a printed invoice that included unpaid interest, legal fees, inspection fees, administrative charges, and a penalty for deterioration of the secured property. Clara read the total twice. $683. The original principal had been $400. She placed her blue account book beside the invoice and opened it to the first payment. Silas did not touch it. "You have counted money already paid," she said. "I have counted money properly documented. You have charged inspection fees. No inspector came. One was assigned. You have charged deterioration. The roof is deficient. I replaced half of it last autumn. Then the remaining half is deficient." Clara studied his face, searching for the grain her father had taught her to find in difficult men. Fear, pride, envy, hunger, shame, some hidden weakness that would explain the shape of his cruelty. There was only appetite made orderly. Silas Bell did not hate her. Hatred was too personal. He wanted the property because the railroad had announced a freight spur east of town, and the Vale lot stood near the proposed line. Her shop, her father's grave view, her years of labor, the burn marks in the floor, the height of the anvil, the pegs worn hollow by tool handles, all of it had become a column of figures beneath the heading of future value. He pushed a document across the desk. It was not an offer. It was a verdict. The notice gave Clara 9 days to satisfy the debt or surrender the premises, fixtures, attached structures, and all secured contents. "There is error here," she said. "There is accounting. There is theft." Silas folded his hands. "That word has legal meaning. I advise you to use it carefully." She looked at the rows of ledgers behind him, each spine marked in white ink, each volume containing the reduced shape of someone's winter, illness, failed crop, dead horse, or buried child. There was no room for argument. Clara closed her blue book. She did not plead. She did not weep. On the 9th morning, a deputy arrived with 2 bank clerks and an inventory sheet. He read the order aloud in the yard, though Clara stood 3 feet from him and had already read the same language twice. His voice remained flat as he named the forge, bellows, swage block, post vise, drill press, workbench, lumber rack, coal reserve, residence, yard, and outbuilding. The cruelty lay not in shouting, but in sequence. Each object was spoken, marked, and taken from her life. Clara packed 2 dresses, 3 shirts, stockings, a comb, a tin cup, a sewing roll, her father's Bible, and the blue account book. She wrapped the machinist's hammer in a square of wool and placed it at the center of the bundle. The deputy told her the hammer might be considered shop property. She unwrapped it. "My father gave it to me 6 years before the mortgage." The deputy looked toward the bank clerk. The clerk shrugged. Clara wrapped it again. At noon, Silas Bell came to the gate. He did not enter. He carried no umbrella, though a light rain had begun to stipple the dust. One of the clerks handed him the inventory, and he checked the final page before signing his name. Clara stood beneath the eave with her bundle in one hand and her coat over the other arm. Silas looked at her for less than a second. "The residence must be vacated now," he said. "It is." He nodded toward the road. That was all. No curse followed her. No crowd gathered. No thunder rolled over the river. The forge had gone cold before breakfast, and a thin thread of rainwater ran black beneath its door, carrying soot into the yard. Clara stepped beyond the gate. She did not look back. By evening, she had crossed the river on a packet boat crowded with crates of chickens, flour barrels, and 2 families bound for Kansas. The town diminished behind smoke and rain until its roofs became a dark seam along the water. She carried $11.40. She carried the blue book. She carried the hammer. The hammer was heavier than the money and more useful than the book, but all 3 belonged to the same inheritance: labor remembered, debt recorded, and knowledge made physical. For 3 days, Clara traveled west by rail in the cheapest car, seated upright among farm families, discharged soldiers, laborers, widows, and men whose boots held red earth from places she had never seen. Beyond the glass, the country widened. Fences grew farther apart. Orchards gave way to pasture, pasture to raw grass, and raw grass to distances that seemed not empty, but unfinished. Managed prosperity fell behind her 1 mile at a time. First went the painted barns. Then the mills. Then church steeples, hedgerows, brick depots, stone culverts, and the black shine of plowed ground. The towns became smaller and farther apart. Lumber walls replaced brick. Water towers stood like solitary sentries above platforms silvered by wind. At every stop, people descended with trunks, rifles, churns, seed sacks, iron stoves, and framed portraits wrapped in quilts, carrying whole households into country that had offered them no promise beyond space. Clara watched them go. She had no household to unload. At the end of the line, she purchased passage in a freight wagon heading southwest through the territory, where old military roads wandered between dry basins and mountain ranges the color of cooled slag. The driver asked her destination. She told him she had none. He considered this, then pointed toward a space between flour sacks and a broken harrow. Then west is as good as any. Clara climbed aboard. The road narrowed. The sky grew larger. Behind her lay ledgers, locks, and the clean black signature of Silas Bell. Ahead lay alkali flats, abandoned grades, wind-planed mesas, and towns that had risen for mines or rails and died when both went elsewhere. She sat with the wrapped hammer across her knees. The wagon rolled on. And for the first time since her father's death, there was nothing left beneath her feet that anyone else could take. The freight wagon reached San Marcial 3 evenings later, arriving beneath a sky the color of burnished copper where the last light rested upon distant ridges before surrendering to the long blue shadows that belonged only to the desert. Clara climbed down stiffly, her boots coated in pale dust that found every seam of leather, every fold of cloth, and every line upon a traveler's hands. She thanked the driver, lifted her bundle onto one shoulder, and watched the wagon disappear toward the Rio Grande until its wheels became nothing more than drifting clouds of powder against the horizon. Silence gathered quickly after it left. It was not the silence of forests, where birds and insects stitched sound together without pause. It was the silence of immense distance, where every noise stood alone, carried so far that a single hammer strike or barking dog seemed to belong to another world entirely. San Marcial had once expected greatness. The evidence remained everywhere. Broad streets had been surveyed for traffic that never came. Storefronts still carried faded lettering beneath peeling paint. A hotel stood with cracked windows staring over an empty square where freight wagons had once gathered around water troughs. The depot itself remained standing, though one platform had sagged toward the earth and the freight scales leaned at an angle that suggested they had long ago surrendered to gravity rather than commerce. The railroad had promised prosperity. The railroad had chosen another route. The town had never recovered. A handful of people still remained. An elderly woman swept dust from a porch that no customers crossed. 2 boys chased one another around stacked barrels whose contents had long since disappeared. A black dog slept beneath the shade of a broken wagon. No one hurried. There was nowhere left worth hurrying toward. Clara found lodging impossible to afford. The boarding house keeper looked at the coins in her hand, counted them twice, and gently shook his head. "You'd best keep those. There is nowhere else? There are roofs." He pointed toward the edge of town. "They simply don't belong to anyone who intends to fix them." She thanked him and walked on. As evening settled across the empty streets, she found an abandoned freight shed near the old rail yard. Half its roof had collapsed years before, but one corner remained dry beneath heavy timber beams darkened by age and smoke. She swept away broken glass with a cedar branch, spread her blanket across weathered planks, and fetched water from the public pump before darkness claimed the square. It was enough. She had shelter. She had water. She had tomorrow. Her father had often said that work always began with those 3 things. The following morning Clara wandered through the remnants of the settlement, asking quiet questions wherever she found someone willing to answer. She asked about blacksmith work. There was little. She asked about wagon repairs. Almost none. She asked whether anyone remembered the abandoned railroad surveys that had once crossed the basin. That question earned curious looks. One old merchant finally nodded toward a crumbling adobe office near the edge of town. Old survey records. They still there? If mice haven't learned to read. The building had once belonged to a government surveyor before funding disappeared and the office closed. Dust covered everything inside. Shelves leaned beneath stacks of rolled plats, brittle field notes, and leather tubes tied with faded string. Rain had entered through one broken corner of the roof, staining entire bundles beyond recognition. Near the back, a county clerk arranged papers into separate piles with the weary patience of a man who had accepted that history rarely paid wages. You buying? He asked without looking up. If something has no use. Most of it. He gestured toward several boxes filled with unwanted maps. Rail grades. Mining claims. Irrigation proposals. Surveys that never became anything. Clara knelt beside them. The paper cracked softly beneath careful fingers. She unfolded map after map. Some showed mountain passes. Some marked wells that had failed before completion. Others recorded proposed settlements whose names had already vanished from memory. At the bottom lay one sheet folded into quarters, stained with water and edged with mildew. The paper itself had once been fine linen stock, stronger than ordinary survey sheets. Across its surface ran a narrow railroad grade beginning near the Rio Grande before wandering southwest into country that appeared empty. Then the line simply stopped. No explanation. No completed junction. No station. Nothing beyond a penciled notation nearly erased by time. Temporary works. Nearby someone had added another sentence in darker ink. Engine lost during storm. Location uncertain. Clara studied the handwriting. The notation had not been made by the surveyor. It had been added later. Someone had wanted the information remembered. Someone else had forgotten. What do you want for this one? The clerk barely glanced toward it. $2. Only because it's linen paper. Worth more than common stock. Clara turned the sheet over. Blank. No official seal. No active claim. No signature granting ownership. Nothing but forgotten measurements and a vanished railroad grade leading into miles of barren country. Another customer laughed from across the room. You planning to build yourself a railroad? The clerk smiled faintly. Maybe she'll find the engine. The room joined the joke. Not cruelly. Simply because hope attached to abandoned things often sounded amusing to people who had stopped hoping themselves. Clara folded the map carefully. I'll take it. She counted out $2 silver. As the clerk wrapped the paper in brown cloth, he shrugged. Best bargain I've made all month. It may be. You truly think there's something out there? Clara rested her hand upon the bundle containing her father's hammer. I think someone drew that line for a reason. Outside, the laughter lingered behind her only a moment before the wind carried it away. She did not regret the purchase. Years beside her father's bench had taught her that useful things often wore the appearance of scrap until someone understood their purpose. An old wagon axle looked worthless until its iron was reforged. A cracked plain body still held an excellent blade. Broken harness buckles became hinges. Discarded horseshoes became nails. Nothing deserved dismissal merely because others no longer recognized its value. She found a shaded place beside the freight shed and spread the survey across an empty crate. The measurements fascinated her. Distances. Bearings. Elevation marks. Drainage channels. Every figure had been written by someone whose work demanded precision rather than imagination. Surveyors lied less often than speculators. The land either stood where it was measured or it did not. Late that afternoon a shadow crossed the map. You reading, Mercer? Clara looked up. The speaker appeared nearly 70, broad-shouldered despite his age, with a beard gone almost entirely white beneath years of desert sun. His shirt had once belonged to railroad service, faded blue beneath countless repairs. One sleeve had been patched with canvas so many times that original cloth scarcely remained. "I don't know Mercer." "I did." The old man lowered himself carefully onto an overturned barrel. "Thomas Mercer. Survey engineer." He pointed toward the map. "That's his hand? You worked together?" "For 12 years. What became of him?" The old man removed his hat. "Buried out there somewhere." He nodded toward the open country beyond town. "My name's Amos Cutter." Clara introduced herself. Amos studied the map without touching it. "I helped lay part of that grade." "It ends suddenly." "It did. What happened?" "The desert happened." He smiled sadly. "Folks back east think deserts are empty. They aren't. They're full of waiting." He explained that 30 years earlier a private railroad company had attempted to establish a shortcut across the basin before federal contracts favored another route farther north. Crews graded miles of earth, hauled ties across impossible country, and pushed a construction locomotive farther than anyone believed practical. Then came a violent sandstorm unlike any living worker had witnessed before or since. Visibility vanished. Equipment scattered. Men became separated. When the storm finally ended, part of the grade itself had disappeared beneath towering dunes. Several workers died. Others resigned. The company abandoned the entire project within weeks. "The locomotive?" Clara asked. "Never found. Surely they searched." "For months." "And?" Amos looked toward the distant hills. "The desert keeps what it chooses." Clara unfolded the map again. This note: "Engine lost during storm." Mercer added that after everyone else gave up. "You know that?" "I watched him write it." The words settled between them. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally Amos leaned closer. "Mercer believed the engine hadn't wandered." "What then?" "It had sunk." "Sunk?" "The storm moved sand like floodwater moves mud. Whole cuts filled overnight. Gullies disappeared. Wagons vanished axle deep." He traced one weathered finger toward the map's ending. "He always believed the locomotive lay exactly where it stopped. Only 30 feet lower than anyone expected." Clara felt something quiet shift inside her. Not certainty. Direction. "Did he ever return?" "Every spring." "For 30 years?" Amos nodded. "Until his heart gave out." "What was he looking for?" The old railroad man hesitated. "I asked him once." "And?" "He said the engine carried more than machinery." "What did he mean?" "He never answered." Evening descended while they continued studying faded measurements and forgotten landmarks. Amos pointed out dry washes that still existed, volcanic outcrops unchanged by time, and ridges whose shapes remained unmistakable despite drifting sand. At last he rolled the map closed. "If you're fool enough to chase Mercer," he smiled, "I suppose I'm fool enough to help." "Why?" The old man looked toward the abandoned tracks stretching eastward. "Because I spent 30 years wondering whether an honest man died trying to protect something worth finding." The next morning they prepared carefully. There was no excitement. Only work. Amos borrowed a sturdy mule named Gideon from a neighbor in exchange for repairing a broken gate later that week. Clara purchased flour, salt pork, dried beans, coffee, lamp oil, and 2 additional water casks, spending less than she wished and more than she preferred. She examined every rope before loading it. She checked every buckle. She sharpened a spade whose edge had dulled from years of neglect and selected a heavy iron pry bar scarred by old railroad labor. Each tool earned its place. Her father would have approved. Before sunrise they left San Marcial, following the abandoned grade exactly as Mercer's map instructed. At first the path remained obvious. Low embankments crossed shallow washes. Fragments of rotten ties protruded through gravel like old bones. Occasionally they found rusted spikes half buried beneath creosote bushes. Evidence remained. The farther they traveled, the fainter it became. Wind had spent 3 decades patiently erasing the work of hundreds of laborers. Nature possessed remarkable endurance. Yet so did craftsmanship. Every few miles Clara stopped to compare the landscape against Mercer's careful measurements. Distances matched astonishingly well. Hills aligned precisely with his bearings. Dry arroyos curved where his pencil declared they would. She began trusting the dead surveyor. Late on the fourth afternoon they climbed a ridge overlooking an immense basin where towering dunes shimmered beneath relentless sunlight. The railroad grade vanished. Not ended. Vanished. Sand rolled across the basin in graceful waves, burying everything beneath smooth, golden slopes that revealed nothing of what lay underneath. Amos removed his hat. "This is where they quit searching." Clara looked from the desert to the folded map in her hands. Somewhere beneath that silent sea of sand rested the answer Thomas Mercer had pursued until the end of his life. Somewhere beneath those dunes lay an engine the world believed lost forever. She tightened her grip upon the hammer wrapped inside her bundle. Everything had a grain. The desert would have one as well. She simply had to learn how to work with it, not against it. They did not begin by digging. The desert punished haste as surely as fire punished carelessness, and Clara knew from years beside the forge that every difficult task yielded first to observation, then to labor. She and Amos spent an entire morning walking the basin while Mercer's survey rested open upon a flat stone, weighted at the corners with chunks of weathered basalt so the wind could not claim it. The dunes were not fixed. That became clear before noon. Fine streams of sand crept along every ridge beneath the steady breath of the western wind. Sharp edges softened. Hollows filled. Crests wandered almost imperceptibly. A place that appeared unchanged from one hour to the next revealed subtle differences by evening. "The storm buried it," Amos said quietly. "The years kept burying it." Clara nodded. "And the years may also uncover it." They searched for what the desert could not easily erase. The survey marked a shallow volcanic outcrop beside the end of the temporary grade. Stone did not drift. Stone remembered. Late the following afternoon Clara climbed a low ridge of black lava whose broken surface stood above the surrounding sand exactly where Mercer had drawn it 30 years before. From its highest point she measured the distances written in his careful hand, pacing each length twice before driving a cedar stake into the ground. Again she measured. Again she checked the map. Nothing about the work invited excitement. It demanded patience. The first shovel entered the sand the next morning. The upper layers yielded easily enough, dry as flour and endlessly willing to slide back into the hole from which they had just been lifted. Clara quickly abandoned the idea of digging straight downward. Instead she widened the excavation, cutting broad sloping sides that would not collapse beneath their own weight. Her father had once told her that the shortest path often became the longest repair. She remembered. For 6 days they moved sand. The work settled into rhythm. Dig. Lift. Carry. Return. Morning winds cooled their faces until the sun climbed high enough to turn every iron tool too hot for bare hands. By noon their shirts clung with sweat despite the desert's dry air. Every evening they brushed grit from their blankets before sleeping beneath a sky crowded with stars so numerous that the darkness itself seemed woven from light. They found nothing. On the 7th day Amos leaned against his shovel and smiled without discouragement. "I've laid 20 miles of railroad." He wiped dust from his beard. "This still beats carrying ties." Clara laughed softly. It was the first laughter either of them had offered the desert. The following morning her shovel struck something harder than compacted sand. Thunk. She froze. Again she drove the blade downward. Thunk. Not stone. Stone answered differently. She knelt immediately, abandoning the shovel in favor of her hands. Grain by grain she cleared away the pale sand until black iron emerged beneath her fingertips, rough with scale yet unmistakably shaped by human workmanship. "A riveted plate," she called Amos. Together they uncovered another section. Then another. Curved. Massive. A boiler. The locomotive had been there all along. It had never wandered. Mercer had been right. They did not cheer. Instead they stood quietly, hats removed, looking upon the great machine that had waited beneath the desert for 3 decades while seasons, governments, fortunes, and entire generations passed overhead without suspecting its presence. The excavation became more demanding. Sand pressed constantly against the exposed iron, eager to reclaim what had been disturbed. Clara built timber braces from mesquite trunks gathered along a distant wash. Amos fashioned crude retaining walls from discarded railroad ties they discovered scattered across the basin. Every improvement cost another day. Every day protected the next. As more of the engine emerged, Clara recognized details her father had once explained while repairing machinery brought upriver on barges from eastern foundries. Driving wheels, valve gear, connecting rods. The smokestack had been crushed beneath shifting weight years before, but much of the locomotive remained astonishingly whole, sealed by the very sand that had hidden it. The tender rested directly behind the engine. Its coal compartment had long since emptied through rusted seams. The water cistern remained intact. Near its forward bulkhead stood a heavy iron hatch unlike anything Clara expected. "No water fitting," Amos murmured. "No." She brushed away more grit. "A storage compartment." The lock had fused solid with corrosion. Clara unwrapped her father's hammer. Its hickory handle, worn smooth by his grip, settled naturally into her hand despite years that separated them. She examined the hinges first. Then the rivets. Then the frame. Everything had a grain. Even rust. She selected a narrow cold chisel, positioned it carefully where corrosion had swollen between lock and hasp, and struck once. Clang. A chip of rust flew. Again. Clang. The echo rolled across the empty basin before fading into silence. Again. Again. Not harder. Truer. The lock fractured along the line she had anticipated. One final measured blow. Clang. The hasp fell free. Together they lifted the hatch. Air untouched for 30 years escaped with the faint odor of old iron, damp wood, and coal dust. Inside lay 6 stout oak chests secured with leather straps that had long ago turned brittle. Beside them rested a small iron dispatch box bearing the faded initials TM. Thomas Mercer. Clara opened the smallest chest first. Within neat canvas bags lay gold. Double eagles. Hundreds of them. The coins caught the afternoon light with quiet brilliance, untouched by tarnish, each bearing the worn profile of liberty exactly as it had the day the chest disappeared beneath the storm. Neither Clara nor Amos reached for a single coin. They simply looked. The second chest held more. So did the third. Enough wealth rested within the tender to purchase farms, mills, warehouses, entire streets of prosperous towns. The dispatch box proved heavier than its size suggested. Inside rested a leather ledger wrapped carefully in oilcloth, together with a sealed envelope whose wax remained astonishingly unbroken. Across its face Mercer had written only 4 words. "To whoever finds this." Clara broke the seal with careful fingers. The paper crackled softly. Mercer's handwriting remained steady. "If these words are read, then Providence has granted what my strength could not." The locomotive did not perish by misfortune alone. It carried payroll entrusted to the Western Continental Rail Company, together with account books proving that Mr. Horace Bell, company treasurer, conspired to steal payment owed to laborers, suppliers, widows, and contractors whose names appear within the enclosed ledger. When discovery became certain, he ordered false invoices prepared and intended that blame should rest upon those already dead in the storm. I refused. Before I could return east, the great wind buried both engine and evidence. Many honest families have suffered because truth remained hidden beneath this desert. Should another soul find these pages, I beg only this. Do not seek revenge. Restore what was taken. Let honest work finish what dishonest ambition began. Thomas Mercer, Chief Survey Engineer. September 17, 1842. Neither Clara nor Amos spoke. The desert seemed to grow still around them. At last Clara opened the ledger. Each page listed names. Freight haulers. Stone masons. Blacksmiths. Timber contractors. Rail workers. Merchants. Beside each appeared amounts withheld, false debts entered, forged adjustments, and payments redirected into accounts controlled by Horace Bell. One surname caused Clara to stop breathing for an instant. Bell. She looked again. Horace Bell. The father of Silas Bell. The same family. The same arithmetic. The same habit of turning paper into theft. Her father's words returned with startling clarity. Everything has a grain. She finally understood. Cruelty had possessed one as well. It had simply passed from father to son. Amos looked toward the waiting chests. What now? Clara closed the ledger gently. We do exactly what Mercer asked. You could own half the territory. I could. And? She rested one hand upon the weathered cover. It would not be mine. They returned to San Marcial with only the ledger, the letter, and enough gold to secure the buried locomotive against thieves while proper excavation could continue. Word spread slowly. Not because Clara announced it. Because honest labor was difficult to hide. She hired local teamsters. She paid fair wages in coin. She employed carpenters to build lifting frames. Blacksmiths repaired forgotten tools. Stone masons reinforced storage vaults. Money that had slept beneath the desert began moving through calloused hands exactly as Mercer had hoped. Then Clara began traveling. Not in search of wealth. In search of names. The ledger became her constant companion. She rode from settlement to settlement locating widows whose husbands had vanished from railroad payrolls decades before. She found grown children who remembered fathers speaking bitterly of wages that never arrived. She discovered merchants whose grandparents had failed after extending credit to a construction company that claimed poverty, while its treasurer quietly enriched himself. Whenever she verified a claim against Mercer's records, she paid the amount owed together with reasonable interest calculated as faithfully as her father once balanced repair accounts. Every payment required a receipt. Every receipt she filed carefully inside a new ledger. Justice, she believed, deserved orderly bookkeeping no less than dishonesty had. Some recipients wept. Others simply removed their hats. Many refused to believe such honesty still existed until the gold rested in their own hands. None heard Clara speak the Bell name with anger. She never carried the matter to court. Too many guilty men had died. Too many witnesses had long since been buried. She never visited a newspaper office. Scandal would have filled columns. Restoration filled cupboards. The difference mattered. San Marcial changed almost without noticing. The abandoned boarding house received a new roof. The public well gained a fresh pump handle forged in Clara's shop. Children once carrying buckets from distant springs drew clean water within the square again. A cooper reopened his workshop. A farrier established new stocks beside the livery. Freight wagons, hearing that honest repairs and fair prices could still be found there, began stopping more often. The town did not become wealthy. It became useful. That proved enough. Clara purchased an empty smithy overlooking the old rail yard and rebuilt it board by board. The forge burned each morning before sunrise. Travelers brought broken wagon tongues, cracked hinges, worn axle boxes, bent branding irons, damaged plows, and mining drills chipped against granite. She repaired each with the same care Elias Vale had taught her. People no longer introduced her as the woman who had been cast out. They called her Miss Vale, the smith. Respect entered her name quietly. Far away, the Bell interests began to shrink. Old account books surfaced. Families compared receipts. Creditors asked questions that careful bookkeeping could no longer silence. Investors quietly withdrew. Silas Bell's empire of paper did not collapse in a dramatic afternoon. It simply eroded. One office closed. Then another. Properties changed hands. His signature appeared less frequently in commercial notices. Eventually even that ceased. Someone remarked that he had gone east. Someone else claimed Chicago. Another believed St. Louis. No one knew. Clara never saw him again. She did not search. Years passed. The locomotive remained where it had been found, preserved as carefully as circumstances allowed, a monument not merely to engineering but to endurance, patience, and truth delayed without being defeated. Children often asked Clara whether she regretted spending $2 on an old map everyone else believed worthless. She always smiled. No. It was the best $2 I ever spent. In the evenings she returned to a modest house whose porch faced the desert beyond town. Inside, above the stone fireplace, rested three objects upon a narrow walnut mantel. Her father's machinist's hammer, its hickory handle worn smooth by his grip. Thomas Mercer's final letter, preserved beneath glass. The ledger whose pages recorded every debt restored and every receipt collected. Visitors sometimes admired the gold coins displayed elsewhere. Clara valued those three things more. One represented knowledge honestly given. One represented truth faithfully kept. One represented justice completed by patient hands. Together they formed her true inheritance. She was 28 years old and had been cast out with $11.40. She spent $2 on a useless map that everyone else saw as junk. It was the best $2 she ever spent. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who believes that quiet strength, honest work, and patient kindness still matter, and subscribe for more stories like this. Before you go, leave us one thought. What have you found value in that others had already written off or overlooked? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.